Yeah, he was in Australia. How random. I feel like I didn't even know about it. At 11:23 p.m. on December 15th, King Charles placed his signature on a constitutional document that had been debated in secret for 8 months. By dawn, the line of succession looked fundamentally different than it had 24 hours earlier. What forced his hand was not scandal or crisis, but a medical reality the palace could no longer ignore. The midnight signature. The signing took place in the blue drawing room at Clarence House, a space Charles had always preferred for its intimacy and warmth. Outside, London slept under a December cold that had settled deep into the stone and pavement. Inside, a small group of witnesses stood in near silence, watching as the king took up his pen and began the careful work of altering constitutional history. When he finally signed, the stroke of his pen was firm and deliberate. Charles R. Written in the distinctive hand that had signed countless documents over a lifetime of royal service, but none quite like this. Beside him, Prince William waited, his own pen ready, his face carefully neutral, but his tension visible in the set of his shoulders. The witnesses, Princess Anne, the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Lord Chamberlain, and a senior representative from the Privy Council stood in a semicircle behind them. No one spoke. The only sounds were the scratch of pen on paper and the faint ticking of a mantel clock that had belonged to Queen Elizabeth. When both signatures were complete, Lord Chamberlain stepped forward to apply the official seal. The document was then placed in a leather portfolio to be delivered immediately to the Constitutional Affairs Office, where it would be registered, copied, and distributed to the appropriate governmental and Commonwealth authorities. There was no champagne, no congratulations, just a quiet acknowledgement from the Archbishop, a brief blessing spoken in the low, careful tone of someone who understood they were witnessing something rare, a king preparing for his own potential incapacity, a son accepting a burden he had hoped would remain theoretical. By the time the witnesses departed just after midnight, the document was already in motion through the constitutional machinery. Secure messages were being sent to prime ministers across the Commonwealth. Legal advisors in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and a dozen other realms were being woken to review the changes and prepare for coordinated public statements at dawn. But in London, where most of the country slept unaware that anything significant had occurred, the night remained quiet. No leaks, no dramatic announcements, just the steady, careful work of an institution preparing itself for realities it hoped would never arrive, but could no longer afford to ignore. When dawn broke on December 16th, the world would learn that the succession had changed, not in the dramatic way of abdication or death, but in something more measured and more modern, a recognition that monarchy, like any institution, must adapt to the complexities of human frailty and medical reality, the medical truth behind the decision. To understand what drove Charles to sign that document on a cold December night, we must look back to the autumn of 2025. When a series of medical appointments began revealing truths the king could no longer dismiss as temporary inconveniences. It started in late September with fatigue that would not lift. Charles, who had always maintained a rigorous schedule and prided himself on his stamina, found himself needing afternoon rests that stretched longer than intended. Engagements that once energized him now left him drained. His private physician, Sir Hugh Rathbone, who had served the royal family for over 2 decades, noticed the pattern and quietly requested comprehensive testing. The results delivered in early October were not catastrophic, but they were concerning. Charles's heart function showed signs of stress consistent with his age and decades of demanding schedules. There were early indicators of vascular fatigue, nothing immediately life-threatening, but conditions that required careful management and would likely progress slowly over time. More significantly, the testing revealed that Charles's capacity for sustained high-level decision-making was beginning to show strain under prolonged stress. It was not dementia or cognitive decline in the traditional sense, but rather a subtle reduction in stamina that affected his ability to process complex information during long working days. Sir Hugh delivered the news with characteristic directness during a private meeting at Burke Hall in mid-October. Your Majesty, you can continue your duties effectively for some time, potentially years, but we must be realistic about managing your workload and preparing for the possibility that at some point the demands of the role may exceed your capacity to fulfill them without risk to your health. Charles had sat in silence for a long time after that conversation, staring out at the Scottish landscape he loved. He had waited his entire life to be king. He had become monarch at an age when most men were long retired, and now, barely 3 years into his reign, he was being told that his time might be more limited than he had hoped. The constitutional problem was immediate and unavoidable. The British monarchy operated under laws designed in an era when medical science could not sustain life or manage chronic conditions the way it could now. The existing provisions for regency, created after the abdication crisis of 1936, assumed a binary state. A monarch was either fully capable or completely incapacitated. There was no legal framework for partial capacity, for a king who could fulfill some duties but not others, for a gradual transition rather than a sudden crisis. Charles understood the implications instinctively. If his health declined to the point where he could no longer fulfill his constitutional duties, the current system would require a formal declaration of incapacity, a process that would be messy, public, and potentially destabilizing. Parliament would need to intervene. The Councillors of State mechanism, designed for temporary absences, was insufficient for long-term health management. Worse still, the lack of clear protocol meant that in a health crisis, the transition to William would be reactive rather than planned, chaotic rather than orderly. And Charles, who had spent his entire life preparing for kingship, could not stomach the idea of leaving his son to inherit the crown under those circumstances. He raised the issue privately with William during a walk at Sandringham in late October. The conversation was difficult, not because William was unwilling to discuss it, but because both men understood what it represented. Charles was acknowledging his own mortality and fragility. William was being asked to prepare for a burden he had hoped would not arrive for many more years. William's first instinct was denial. "You're healthy, father. You're managing well. This seems premature." Charles shook his head. "I'm managing now, but Sir Hugh has made clear that my capacity will likely decline gradually. And when it does, we cannot afford to have the constitutional framework decided in a crisis. We must plan now while we can do so thoughtfully." William had no response to that. He simply walked beside his father in silence, both of them feeling the weight of what was coming. Princess Anne, brought into the discussions in early November, was characteristically pragmatic. This is precisely why succession planning exists. You are not abdicating, you are ensuring continuity. There is no shame in that. But Charles did feel shame, though he tried not to show it. He had waited so long to be king, and now he was preparing mechanisms to ease himself out of the very role he had spent a lifetime training for. It felt like failure, even though intellectually he understood it was wisdom. The medical reality that had forced this reckoning was not dramatic. Charles was not dying. He was not suffering from a terminal illness. He was simply aging, and aging in a role that demanded more than an aging body could sustainably provide. It was the most human of problems playing out in the most public of lives. And so through October and into November, Charles had authorized his legal advisors to begin drafting a solution, a constitutional mechanism that would allow for a managed transition, a way for William to assume royal powers gradually if Charles's health required it, without the drama of abdication or the chaos of sudden incapacity. By mid-November, the draft document was ready, and Charles faced the most difficult task of all, asking his son to read it. Why succession law needed urgent reform. The legal framework governing the British monarchy had remained essentially frozen since 1936, when Edward VIII's abdication had forced Parliament to clarify succession law in ways it had never needed to before. The resulting legislation, crafted in the shadow of a constitutional crisis, was designed to prevent another Edward situation, to ensure that abdication required parliamentary approval, and that the line of succession remained absolutely clear. But what the 1936 reforms had not anticipated, what no one in that era could have foreseen, was the revolution in medical science that would unfold over the following 9 decades. In 1936, people died quickly from conditions that are now managed for years. Leaders either functioned fully or they did not. There was no grey area, no prolonged decline that modern medicine could extend and manage. By 2025, that binary assumption was dangerously outdated, and Charles, along with his legal advisors, understood that the monarchy could not afford to wait for a crisis to expose the gaps in succession law. The core problem was simple. If Charles became unable to fulfill his duties due to declining health, the current law provided only 2 options. He could abdicate, a process that required parliamentary approval, public announcement, and the permanent surrender of the crown. Or he could be declared incapacitated, a process equally public and equally dramatic, requiring medical assessments, Privy Council intervention, and formal installation of a regent. Neither option allowed for what Charles's physicians predicted was most likely a gradual decline in capacity that would make some duties manageable and others too demanding. There was no legal provision for a king to step back partially, to hand certain constitutional functions to his heir while retaining others, and there was certainly no provision for doing so quietly with dignity without turning the transition into a public spectacle. Charles had watched his mother navigate similar questions in her final years. Queen Elizabeth, determined to serve until her death, had gradually reduced her schedule and delegated more to Charles himself. But those delegations had been informal, based on mutual understanding and palace tradition rather than legal framework. And when Elizabeth died, the transition had been sudden, immediate, and managed only through years of advanced planning. Charles did not want his own transition to depend on either sudden death or public crisis. He wanted a mechanism that acknowledged reality, that allowed for managed change, and that protected both the institution and his son from unnecessary trauma. These were not hostile inquiries. They were practical questions from realms that needed to understand how their constitutional arrangements would function if Britain's monarch faced health challenges. And the palace's inability to provide clear answers was itself revealing a systemic problem. Princess Anne, who had spent decades observing the monarchy's structural vulnerabilities, pushed hardest for immediate action. "We cannot govern based on hope," she told Charles during a November meeting at Windsor. "We cannot assume you will remain fully capable until sudden death. Medical reality does not work that way anymore, and our constitutional framework must acknowledge that." The legal team working on the solution faced extraordinary challenges. They needed to create a mechanism that was legally binding across 15 Commonwealth realms, each with their own constitutional structures. They needed language that was clear enough to prevent ambiguity, but flexible enough to accommodate different scenarios. And most delicately, they needed to craft something that would not be interpreted as Charles admitting weakness or preparing to abdicate. First, it did not require a formal declaration of incapacity. Instead, it allowed the monarch to voluntarily transfer specific constitutional powers to the heir. If medical advice suggested such transfer would better serve the crown's stability, the decision remained entirely with the monarch, but it was based on medical reality rather than political pressure. Second, the transfer could be partial and gradual. William could assume powers over certain areas, such as hosting state visits or conducting investments, while Charles retained others, such as weekly audiences with the Prime Minister or approval of certain state documents. This flexibility acknowledged that capacity was not binary, that someone could be capable in some areas while struggling in others. Third, and most importantly, the mechanism was designed to be reversible. If Charles's health stabilized or improved, powers could be returned. This was not abdication disguised as health management. It was a genuine attempt to create constitutional flexibility. The Commonwealth realms, consulted secretly throughout the drafting process, had responded with cautious support. Most recognised that their own succession laws needed similar modernisation. Canada's constitutional advisors had been particularly helpful, drawing on their experience with prime ministerial transitions involving health concerns. By early December, the document was ready. The final draft sat on Charles's desk at Clarence House, waiting for the moment when he would need to share it with the person it affected most directly. Prince William, his son, his heir, the man who would bear the burden of this new constitutional arrangement, the document William didn't want to read. The envelope arrived at Kensington Palace on December 12th, delivered by royal courier under the highest level of security classification. William's private secretary brought it to him during a late afternoon meeting, interrupting with an apologetic expression that immediately told William this was not routine correspondence. "From His Majesty," the secretary said quietly, "for your eyes only, to be read in private." William dismissed the meeting and sat alone in his study as winter darkness gathered outside the windows. The envelope was thick, bound with the king's personal seal. Inside he found two items: a formal legal document, the draft of the Transitional Regency Protocol, and a personal letter from his father handwritten on Clarence House stationery. William read the letter first. "My dearest William," it began in Charles's distinctive sloping script. "What follows is difficult to write and will likely be difficult to read, but it is necessary, and I believe you will understand why." The letter explained in more personal terms than any medical report could what Charles had been experiencing: the fatigue, the medical consultations, the growing awareness that his capacity to serve as king might be limited by time and health in ways he had not anticipated. Charles wrote with a vulnerability William had rarely seen from his father, acknowledging fears and frustrations that the king would never express publicly. "I do not know how much time I have to serve effectively," Charles had written. "It may be many years, it may be fewer than I hope, but I cannot in good conscience leave these questions unanswered until crisis forces answers upon us both." The letter concluded with a request. "Read the document, consider what it asks of you, and when you are ready, let us discuss it together. This is not something I can decide alone." William set the letter aside and turned to the legal document. The language was dense, filled with constitutional terminology and legal provisions, but its core meaning was clear. If Charles's health declined to the point where medical advice suggested a partial transfer of duties, this protocol would allow William to assume those duties without the drama of abdication or formal incapacity proceedings. William read it twice, then set it down and stared at nothing in particular. His first emotion was not preparedness or duty, it was a refusal. He did not want this responsibility. Not now, not like this. His father had waited his entire life to be king. William had expected to wait similarly long. The idea of assuming royal powers while his father still lived, still wore the crown, felt wrong in ways he could not fully articulate. Catherine found him an hour later, still sitting in the darkening study. She turned on a lamp and sat beside him without speaking, waiting for him to find words. He wants me to share the crown, William finally said, while he is still alive, while he can still function. Catherine glanced at the documents on his desk. Is he ill? Not acutely, but it is declining gradually, and he wants to manage the transition while he can still make clear decisions about it. Catherine considered this. That seems wise. William shook his head. It seems like I'm waiting for him to weaken so I can take his place. That's not what this is, Catherine said gently. This is your father trying to protect you from having the transition happen in crisis. He is giving you time to prepare. That is a gift, not a burden. It feels like both, William admitted. They sat in silence for a while. Outside, London's evening traffic hummed distantly. Inside, the weight of succession pressed down on both of them with a force they had intellectually prepared for, but emotionally were not ready to bear. Catherine spoke again, her voice quiet but firm. Your father spent 70 years waiting, watching his mother work until she died in office. He knows what that cost her, and he knows what it would cost you if he did the same. This is not weakness, William. This is him loving you enough to spare you the worst of what he endured. William looked at her, seeing the strength that had made her such a steady partner through everything the royal role had thrown at them. You think I should agree to this? I think you should talk to him, Catherine replied. And I think you should understand that refusing this does not protect him. It only makes the inevitable harder when it comes. William knew she was right, but knowing something intellectually and accepting it emotionally remained two different things. He requested a meeting with his father for December 14th. The 2 days between gave him time to consult privately with constitutional experts to understand fully what the document entailed and to prepare himself for a conversation he had never imagined having. The meeting took place at Clarence House on a cold evening that smelled of approaching snow. Charles had set aside 2 hours, clearing his calendar completely. They sat in the same blue drawing room where the signing would eventually take place, though neither of them knew that yet. William began carefully. I have read the document and your letter, and I understand why you believe this is necessary. Charles waited, sensing the hesitation in his son's voice. But I do not want to appear eager for this, William continued. I do not want people to think I am pushing you aside. Charles leaned forward, his expression gentle but serious. You have never been eager for my position, William. You have carried your role with reluctance and duty in equal measure. No one who knows you could possibly believe you are pushing me aside. Then what will they believe? William asked. That you are too weak to continue? That the crown is crumbling? Charles shook his head. They will believe, because we will tell them clearly that we are modernizing how succession functions, that we are planning responsibly for realities that medical science has made newly relevant. There is no shame in that. William looked down at his hands. This means you are preparing to step back. This means, Charles corrected gently, that I am preparing for the possibility that I may need to step back. If that time never comes, then this protocol sits unused. But if it does come, we will be ready. And you will not be forced to assume everything at once during a crisis. The conversation continued for over an hour, moving through practical details and emotional undercurrents. Charles explained the medical realities he faced. William expressed his fears about assuming power prematurely. And gradually, through the kind of honest conversation fathers and sons rarely manage, they reached understanding. By the time William left Clarence House that evening, he had not yet agreed to sign. But he had agreed to consider it seriously. And Charles, reading his son's face, understood that consideration would lead to acceptance. Not because William wanted this, but because he understood, as Charles did, that the crown required it. 2 days later, on the evening of December 15th, William returned to Clarence House with Catherine. He had made his decision, and though it pained him, though it felt like stepping into his father's shadow before his father had fully stepped out of it, he understood that this was what duty required. The signing would happen that night. And by morning, the line of succession would function differently than it had for nearly 90 years. The silent witnesses and what they saw. By 10.405 p.m. on December 15th, the blue drawing room at Clarence House had been prepared for a ceremony that no one present would ever forget, though few outside that room would fully understand its significance. The furniture had been arranged with careful attention to both formality and intimacy. A mahogany desk borrowed from the palace archive and used historically for treaty signings sat at the center of the room. 2 chairs had been placed before it, one for Charles and one for William. Behind them, space had been made for witnesses to stand at a respectful distance, close enough to observe but far enough to grant the moment appropriate solemnity. Princess Anne arrived first, punctual as always, dressed in a dark suit that seemed appropriate for the gravity of the occasion without suggesting mourning. She greeted Charles with a brief kiss on the cheek and a searching look that asked without words whether he was certain about this course of action. Charles's slight nod confirmed that he was. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, arrived moments later, his presence lending spiritual weight to what was fundamentally a constitutional proceeding. He'd been briefed in detail over the preceding days and understood that while his role was ceremonial, his witness would be recorded in history. The Church of England, after all, had been intimately connected to succession questions since Henry VIII, and this moment, quiet though it was, represented another evolution in that long relationship. The Lord Chamberlain, Baron Parker, came next, carrying the official seals that would validate the document once signatures were applied. As the senior officer of the royal household, his presence ensured that the procedural requirements were met precisely. He moved with the efficiency of someone who had managed countless state occasions, but even he seemed affected by the unusual nature of this particular ceremony. The final witness, Dame Margaret Whitmore, represented the Privy Council. Her role was to ensure that the signing complied with constitutional requirements and that the council would be properly notified to ratify the changes at their next meeting. She had served in constitutional law for over 30 years, but had never witnessed anything quite like this, a king voluntarily constraining his own power in anticipation of future incapacity. Prince William arrived at 10:58 p.m., accompanied by Catherine, who would not witness the signing, but whose presence William had quietly requested. She remained in an adjacent room, close enough that William knew she was there, but respecting that the signing itself needed to involve only those with formal constitutional roles. Charles and William stood together for a moment, father and son, king and heir, sharing a silence that carried decades of complicated history. Then Charles gestured to the chairs and both men sat. The document lay on the desk between them, illuminated by 2 standing lamps that cast a warm glow over the proceedings. The Lord Chamberlain had placed 2 fountain pens beside it, traditional instruments for state documents, both bearing the royal cipher. The Archbishop stepped forward, his voice low but clear. Let us begin with a moment of prayer. What followed was brief, a blessing that asked for wisdom, strength, and divine guidance for both men as they undertook this solemn act. The words were traditional, drawn from centuries of church practice, but they felt newly relevant in this modern context where faith and constitutional duty intersected in unexpected ways. When the prayer concluded, the Lord Chamberlain formally presented the document, reading its title aloud, the Transitional Regency Protocol, establishing revised procedures for the transfer of royal powers in circumstances of the sovereign's partial or progressive incapacity. The language was bureaucratic, deliberately dry, but everyone in the room understood what it meant. This was Charles acknowledging his own mortality and fragility. This was William accepting a burden he had hoped would arrive much later. Charles took up his pen first. He read through the document one final time, his reading glasses reflecting the lamplight, his expression composed but carrying unmistakable emotion. When he finally began to sign, the room held its collective breath. Charles R. The signature was firm, each letter carefully formed, the final flourish on the R as decisive as it had been on thousands of previous documents. But this one was different. This one changed the fundamental relationship between a king and his heir. Charles set down his pen and looked at William. The expression that passed between them was complex, carrying apology and hope and sorrow and pragmatism all at once. William understood in that moment that his father was not giving up. He was giving William the tools to take over gracefully if that became necessary. It was, in its way, an act of love. William picked up his own pen. His hand, witnesses later recalled, was steady. He read through the passages that pertained specifically to his responsibilities, the powers he would assume if the protocol was ever activated, the duties he would perform in his father's name. Then he signed William. He did not use a regnal signature as he would when he became king. This was not about assuming the throne. This was about sharing its burden. When both signatures were complete, the Lord Chamberlain applied the official seal, pressing it firmly into the red wax that had been prepared. The sound of the seal breaking the silence seemed louder than it should have been, final and irrevocable. Dame Margaret stepped forward to countersign as witness, followed by the Archbishop and Princess Anne. Each signature added weight, transforming the document from theory into constitutional reality. Anne, as she signed, allowed herself a rare display of emotion. She placed her hand briefly on Charles's shoulder, a gesture so uncharacteristic that several witnesses noted it in their later accounts. Charles reached up and covered her hand with his own, a moment of sibling solidarity that spoke to decades of shared duty and mutual respect. The Archbishop offered a final blessing, his hand raised over both Charles and William. May God grant you both strength for the days ahead, wisdom in the exercise of your duties, and peace in the knowledge that you serve a purpose greater than yourselves. When the ceremony concluded at 1127 p.m., there was no applause, no formal congratulations. Lord Chamberlain collected the documents, now sealed and witnessed, and placed them in the leather portfolio that would carry them to the Constitutional Affairs Office for official registration. The witnesses departed quietly, each understanding that what they had seen would be discussed for years, analysed by historians, and remembered as a turning point in how modern monarchy managed succession. But in that moment, as they left Clarence House and returned to London's sleeping streets, they carried only a sense of having witnessed something both profoundly sad and remarkably wise. Charles and William remained in the blue drawing room after everyone else had gone. Catherine rejoined them, moving to William's side without a word. Queen Camilla, who had waited in her private sitting room during the signing, entered quietly and stood beside Charles. For several minutes, the four of them simply existed together in the aftermath of what had been done. No one felt the need to speak. The document was signed. The future was now structured differently than it had been an hour earlier, and all of them in their different ways were processing what that meant. Finally, Charles broke the silence. "Thank you," he said simply, looking at William. William nodded. "It was the right thing to do, but it was not an easy thing," Catherine added quietly. Charles smiled faintly. "The right things rarely are." They parted shortly after midnight, Charles and Camilla returning to their private apartments, William and Catherine departing for Kensington Palace. The lights in Clarence House dimmed, and London settled into the few remaining hours before. Dawn would bring the news to a world that did not yet know the monarchy had fundamentally changed. What changed, and what it means for the crown? The Buckingham Palace press office released the statement at precisely 7 a.m. on December 16th. Time to reach British morning broadcasts while accommodating time zones across the Commonwealth. The language was careful, measured, designed to inform without alarming. Within minutes, the statement was being analysed by constitutional experts across Britain. The initial reaction was not alarm, but curiosity. Regency protocols had not been significantly updated since the mid-20th century. That Charles had chosen to modernise them seemed on its face responsible rather than concerning. But as journalists and legal scholars began parsing the details released in accompanying briefing documents, the fuller picture emerged. This was not simply administrative housekeeping. This was a fundamental restructuring of how succession could function, creating flexibility where rigidity had previously existed. The key change explained in a detailed annex prepared for Parliament and Commonwealth legislatures centred on the concept of transitional regency. Unlike traditional regency, which required formal declarations of complete incapacity, this new protocol allowed for voluntary partial transfer of powers based on medical advice rather than political determination. Practically, this meant that if Charles's doctors advised that certain royal duties were becoming too demanding for his health, William could assume those specific duties without Charles abdicating or being declared fully incapacitated. The king would retain his title, his position, and those constitutional functions he remained capable of performing. But the burden of the role would be distributed based on medical reality rather than legal fiction. The public reaction measured through social media and snap polling conducted throughout the morning was overwhelmingly positive. 79% of Britons surveyed expressed approval for the changes, with many noting that it seemed wise for Charles to plan proactively rather than wait for crisis. Only 11% expressed concern, primarily focused on whether the changes suggested Charles's health was worse than publicly known. The palace moved quickly to address that concern. A supplementary statement released at 10 a.m. clarified that His Majesty remains in good health and fully capable of fulfilling his duties. This protocol has been enacted as a matter of responsible planning, not in response to immediate medical necessity. Across the Commonwealth, reactions varied slightly but remained generally supportive. Canada's Prime Minister issued a statement praising the King's foresight and confirming that Canadian constitutional arrangements would be updated to reflect the new protocol. Australia's response was more measured, with Republican voices using the moment to argue for severing ties with the monarchy entirely. But even there, polling showed majority support for the King's decision. New Zealand's Prime Minister, who had privately requested clarity on exactly these issues months earlier, expressed relief that the protocol now existed. "This provides the certainty that our constitutional arrangements require," she said, in a brief address to Parliament. American media coverage was characteristically confused. Several major outlets struggled to explain what regency meant in a monarchical context, with some initially reporting, incorrectly, that Charles had abdicated. By midday, corrections had been issued and more nuanced analysis had emerged, but the coverage revealed how little Americans understood about the constitutional mechanics of monarchy. What most coverage missed, both in Britain and internationally, was the deeper significance of what Charles had done. He had not simply updated legal procedures. He had confronted the fundamental tension at the heart of modern monarchy, the conflict between the symbolic importance of a lifetime sovereign and the practical reality that human bodies and minds decline in ways that medicine can now extend but not prevent. For centuries, monarchs had died in office because they had no choice. Modern medicine had created choice, but constitutional law had not caught up. Charles's protocol was an attempt to bridge that gap, to create a mechanism for managed transition that honored both the institution's need for continuity and the individual's need for dignity. William, briefed on the morning's coverage at Kensington Palace, felt a complex mixture of relief and apprehension. The public had received the news calmly, which was good, but he also understood that the protocol's existence would now colour every future speculation about Charles's health. Any minor illness, any reduced schedule would trigger questions about whether the transitional regency was being activated. Catherine, reading through the press summaries beside him, spoke the concern aloud. Every time he cancels an engagement now, people will wonder if this is the beginning. William nodded grimly. That is the price of transparency. We have acknowledged that his capacity may decline. Now every sign of that decline will be magnified. But the alternative, Catherine countered, was waiting until the crisis forced the transition. This way, at least there is a plan. Later that morning, William attended a working breakfast meeting with Charles, Anne, and senior constitutional advisors. The atmosphere was businesslike, focused on implementation details and Commonwealth coordination. But beneath the procedural discussions, a new dynamic was evident. Charles and William were no longer simply king and heir. They were now constitutional partners, linked by a document that acknowledged the transfer of power between them was no longer a distant theoretical possibility, but a practical reality that could unfold at any time. Princess Anne, observing the subtle shift in how her brother and nephew interacted, allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. For years, she had pushed for exactly this kind of forward planning, and watching it unfold validated her belief that the monarchy survived not through rigid adherence to tradition, but through thoughtful adaptation. Μέχρι το βράδυ, καθώς ο κύκλος ειδήσεων προχωρούσε σε άλλες ιστορίες, το παλάτι είχε διαχειριστεί με επιτυχία τη μετάβαση της δημόσιας κατανόησης. Το πρωτόκολλο μεταβατικής αντιβασιλείας ήταν πλέον μέρος του συνταγματικού πλαισίου της Βρετανίας. Είχε γίνει αποδεκτό από το Κοινοβούλιο, είχε συντονιστεί σε ολόκληρη την κοινοπολιτεία και είχε υποστηριχθεί ευρέως από το κοινό. Αλλά μέσα στο παλάτι του Κένσιγκτον, καθώς ο Βίλιαμ καθόταν στο γραφείο του και εξέταζε έγγραφα για τις υποχρεώσεις της επόμενης ημέρας. Το βάρος των αλλαγών τον κατακλείζει πιο πλήρως. Το στέμμα που θα φορούσε μια μέρα είχε πλησιάσει, όχι λόγω του θανάτου του πατέρα του, αλλά χάρη στη σοφία του πατέρα του στον σχεδιασμό για την ανικανότητα. Δεν ήταν η κληρονομιά που είχε φανταστεί, αλλά ίσως σκέφτηκε ήταν η κληρονομιά που απαιτούσε η σύγχρονη μοναρχία. Όχι δραματική παραίτηση ή ξαφνική διαδοχή, αλλά μετρημένη μετάβαση, σχεδιασμένη με προσοχή και εκτελεσμένη με αξιοπρέπεια. Η Κάθριν τον βρήκε εκεί μια ώρα αργότερα να κοιτάζει έξω το σκοτάδι του Δεκεμβρίου. «Σκέφτεσαι πάρα πολύ», είπε απαλά. Ο Βίλιαμ χαμογέλασε αχνά. «Επαγγελματικός κίνδυνος». Κινήθηκε δίπλα του, οι ώμοι τους ακουμπούσαν στην άνετη σιωπή μιας σχέσης που είχε ξεπεράσει όλα όσα απαιτούσε η βασιλική ζωή. «Ο πατέρας σου έδωσε χρόνο», είπε. «Χρόνο να προετοιμαστείς, χρόνο να εξελιχθείς σε αυτό που έρχεται». Αυτό είναι περισσότερο από ότι τι λαμβάνουν οι περισσότεροι κληρονόμοι. Ο Γουλιέλμος ήξερε ότι είχε δίκιο. Ο Κάρολος, ο οποίος περίμενε 70 χρόνια, είχε δώσει στον γιον του κάτι που ο ίδιος δεν είχε λάβει ποτέ. Μια σταδιακή πορεία προς το στέμμα αντί για ένα ξαφνικό σοκ. Σχεδιασμός αντί για κρίση. Συνεργασία αντί για απότομη αντικατάσταση. Ήταν, συνειδητοποίησε ο Βίλιαμ, ίσως το μεγαλύτερο δώρο που θα μπορούσε να του είχε κάνει ο πατέρας του. Όχι το ίδιο το στέμμα, το οποίο τελικά θα ερχόταν ούτως ή άλλως, αλλά το πλαίσιο για να το αναλάβει χωρίς να καταστρέψει ούτε τον ίδιο ούτε τον θεσμό στη διαδικασία. Έξω από το Λονδίνο συνέχιζαν οι βραδινοί του ρυθμοί, αγνοώντας ότι σε ένα ήσυχο γραφείο στο παλάτι του Κένσιγκτον, ο μελλοντικός βασιλιάς επεξεργαζόταν μία αλλαγή που θα καθόριζε τον τρόπο με τον οποίο θα λειτουργούσε η διαδοχή για τις επόμενες γενιές. Το έγγραφο που υπογράφηκε στις 11 και 23 στις 15 Δεκεμβρίου είχε αλλάξει κάτι περισσότερο από τις νομικές διαδικασίες. Έχει αλλάξει τη σχέση μεταξύ πατέρα και γιου, μεταξύ βασιλιά και κληρονόμου, μεταξύ παρόντος και μέλλοντος. Και παρόλο που το κοινό δεν θα μπορούσε ποτέ να κατανοήσει πλήρως το συναισθηματικό βάρος αυτής της αλλαγής, όσοι την είχαν δει, όσοι την είχαν υπογράψει και όσοι θα ζούσαν με τις συνέπειές της, το καταλάβαιναν. Το στέμμα δεν είχε αποδυναμωθεί, είχε προσαρμοστεί και σε αυτήν την προσαρμογή έγκυτο η συνεχιζόμενη επιβίωσή του.